Now, as I've mentioned before, we were looking at tabs at the top here, and the community and 3D Code's developer refer to these as rooms. So probably the most critical rooms you're going to run into is the voxel room, and this is where if you're going to create something from scratch, or if you want to import a model and do some sculpting on it, you're going to want to be in the voxel room. So why that's not the first tab is sort of beyond me, but it's essentially you can do various changes on your model in either voxel mode or surface mode, and I'll explain what the differences are, but both of them take you to the voxel room. So if I click on either one of those, I get a pop-up like this, where I can start with a blank scene. I can open up an existing file. In fact, if I click on that, you'll see various options that I can import: OBJ, Lightwave files, FBX, STL, etc. Oh, I also want to point out that a 3B file is the extension for 3D code. So I also can just click on either one of these spheres, the cube, cylinder, opposable mannequin, basically a male figure to start from, a bust, any one of these. Now, considering the fact that we're dealing with voxels, as I mentioned before, everything is a solid shape in voxel sculpting. So when you're dealing with a solid shape, the size of it makes a difference in terms of how much memory is taken up. So let's say I choose this small sphere. You'll see at the bottom, my representative polygon count would be 14,000. Let's go back and create a new one. But in this case, let's go with the large sphere. In this case, it's 240,000 representative triangles, okay? Now, having said that, that also matters when it comes to the scale of your objects going in and out of this program into other ones or from other ones, but also it affects the memory space in 3D code. So if you have very large objects and your modeling and sculpting is going very slow, and let's say the scale isn't as important or that you can change it later, it might be because your scale is so huge that it's taking up a lot of space and memory that it doesn't need to. So keep that in mind. The other thing I want to point out is that as we move around in 3D code, in fact, let me put another primitive on the scene. I'm going to click on primitives. And the way primitives work is, it'll put a proxy on the screen that doesn't actually exist there. And if I press enter or hit the apply, you'll see that actually does come up. In fact, I'm going to pull up my helper here, because at this point I think it's prudent. So if I hit enter or click on the apply button, it will put this on the screen in the layer I have selected. So let's do that. I'm going to hit enter. And you'll notice a little bit of a change there. And if I go to another tool, it's there. And it looks like I'm rotating the box, but I'm actually not. I'm rotating the whole, the sphere and the box. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. So Control-Z undoes something, Control-Y redoes it. But the sphere is turning. You just don't see it because there's no deformation in the sphere. Whoops. So let's go to grow for a second. And I'm just going to sculpt something on the sphere, just so that we can see that it is rotating, okay? If I wanted to put this cube on a different layer, I'll just click on this plus sign in the Vox tree, and then with that other layer selected, I'll hit enter, and it'll put it in that layer. And we know this because if I hide this layer by clicking on this eye icon, the eye icon will hide whatever's in that layer. Same thing with the other one. So they're definitely on different layers. And if I do some deformation, let's press H over the sphere, right, to select our sphere. Let's do a change on the sphere. Now, if I rotate the scene, the whole thing is rotating because it is one scene. I'm moving, not really moving the scene, I'm moving my camera. So they'll both rotate in that respect, but they're not turning along their axes. We're not translating or rotating or scaling these objects. They're staying put. And so I'm turning on my grid and my axes to show that there are no changes to their actual position on the screen or rotation. Okay, so as we're going through this, another thing that we can do is, let's say I want to take a cube and subtract it from this cube. So let's go back down to our primitives tools here, and I'll change my proxy, scale it down, and what I can do is one of several things to subtract that from the shape it's sitting in. The most and simplest and easiest way to do it would be to hold down Control and Enter. And remember, Control inverts what you're doing. So now what we've done is we've cut a shape or a hole out of this cube. Let me undo that for a second, and I'll do another layer. Now let's name our layers. This is a good practice to get into. So this one was sphere. This one was cube 1. This one is going to be, I don't know, we'll just say rectangle. It's not the right word for it, but something descriptive. And get in that habit, because as your layers become more complex, you'll find, and what's on them, you'll find that you need to do this, and doing it early on is really going to save you a lot of pain later on. So in this case, I want to subtract the rectangle from the cube, and let's say it's already committed to the scene. In fact, I forgot to do that, so let's just go ahead back down to primitives and press Enter. Now, if I hide the rectangle, you've noticed that it's sitting inside the cube in terms of its position, but it's not on the same layer, and it's not subtracting it when I hide it. That's because this just hides the layer and the objects on the layer, but it does no actual transformative options or calculations on the scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on this layer and say Subtract from Cube. And as long as it was sitting inside that shape, it not only deletes the layer, but it deletes what's on that layer from the scene, doing any subtractive operations that need to occur. The same thing would happen if I right-click on Cube 1 and say Merge to Sphere Layer. Now, the difference, though, is that if we uncheck Cube for a second here and just look at our Sphere layer, we've got both the cube and the sphere on the same layer. Okay? Let's hide that layer and go back to Cube. Now, Merge to left this one in place because I might need to use it later. So that's something to be aware of. Another thing you might want to be aware of is, let me undo this for a second, is ghosting in a layer. So if we press this little dot beside cube, you notice that it becomes somewhat transparent. It's ghosted, which means I can't do any operations on it, but it means I can see through it. And that's to help you see through an object to another object. Sometimes you want to just hide the layer outright. Sometimes you want to be able to see through it. So those are helpful. Okay, I guess the other thing to point out is in the voxel room, you also have shaders. Now, these shaders really are helpful and to some degree really don't help at all. And what I mean by that is when you click on a shader and you have a layer selected, you can change what that object looks like. In fact, let's increase the lighting on our scene. Let me float my cursor over here with this light bulb, and I'm going to drag to the right to increase my lighting. And I'm going to drag to the right to increase my ambient lighting. Now, if my shader could pick up ambient lighting, if the one I had chosen could pick up ambient lighting, meaning lighting that surrounds the object and makes the shadows look softer rather than this dark edge, then my shader will pick that up as it changes. The other thing I could do is the light angle here. And I can literally just left click and drag until I get the angle of lighting that I want. Some shaders don't allow these changes. For instance, if I go to this gold looking shader, right? And in fact, I'll assign it to the rectangle as well. If I want to change my ambient lighting, it does nothing. If I want to change my level of lighting, it affects that shader. If I want to change the rotation of my lighting, you'll see that it's not affecting that particular shader. So that's something to be aware of. The other thing to keep in mind is that while you're dealing with, and we'll talk more about shaders later, but while we're dealing with shaders and lighting and we're dealing with voxels, you have a lot of capability, but these shaders right now are more representative of what it would look like with that shader on it, as if it were baked onto an actual model with geometry in it. And if those terms confuse you, let me try to clarify at least as briefly as I can until we go into more detail later, which is, remember, these voxel sculptures aren't geometric. They don't actually have any geometry that you normally see in a game model or a film model that would normally be cut up into geometric shapes that form the person that you've made or the tool that you've made or the whatever it is that you've got on your scene. You can do those things in 3D code, but then to send it over to the paint room so that you paint directly on that geometry, it requires those details that you've sculpted into it to either be baked onto it, or the colors information to be baked onto it, or the lighting information to be baked onto it, depending upon what you're trying to do. So that having been said, some shaders, when you use them, will bake better than others. Some introduce errors. So in general, I would stick with the default shader or some of the other shaders that you've played around with that work really well for baking details in. So let's say I wanted something to have a highly specular, somewhat reflective, metallic look. I might select this shader and then, for all intents and purposes, send it to the paint room, and then I'll have this lighting information sort of baked in there. It works for some workflows and models and intents, but not necessarily for others. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, so we'll go into more about shaders later on. Materials and masks are kind of the same thing in the sense that you can literally paint on, say, color information, but you can also paint on depth information. So in this case, let's say I want to affect this sphere. Now notice I was trying to paint over the sphere, but it doesn't do anything because I don't have the sphere selected. So let's type in sphere again, and it changed the names back because I had when I did my undo, it undid the layer name changes. So you want to do those as you go. So if I want to, I can sculpt over this material, and it's kind of hard to see because of the lighting. It should affect it. Now, let me increase the resolution of this model by clicking on this little icon down at the bottom here. It says increase resolution, which takes up more space in memory, increases my triangle count or representative triangle count, but it also allows better details in your models when you're sculpting over them. So in this case, it wasn't awesome, but it does give you some idea of what's going on. So here's a better one. So if we're using materials, you can get depth information out of that. Or in the paint room, you can also get color information out of that. In fact, you can even paint in the voxel room as well if you're so inclined. But it's usually something that I avoid unless I really need that level of detail to be baked in ahead of time. Masks work in a similar fashion. Now you'll notice this pop up. It popped up with materials and it pops up with masks. But essentially, you can use this panel to pan, rotate, zoom, stretch these masks or materials, and you can even hit reset, and it'll take them back to whatever their default setting was. So let's say I zoom this one out, and it's real tiny, and then I go to another one. It's zoomed to the same scale, I should say, scaled to the same amount as before. So I may have to hit reset to restore this one back to where it was and then go like this. But if I say take it really far down and go back to where I was before, you'll see this one's been zoomed. But if I hit reset, it scales it back to its original scale. And tiling doesn't appear to work with masks, which kind of drives me nuts a little bit. But tiling basically means that you have this mask occurring here, but then it occurs here and it occurs here, and it basically does a tiling effect on your information, on your mask. So if we go to materials, you can see this a little bit better. If I check tile or click tile, it goes from being one single tile to one that goes across, in a tiling effect. And there are other options here you can play with, but that's essentially materials and masks in a nutshell. And again, we'll go into more detail about those later. There's also brushes, which are based on certain tools you have over here. So if you have an airbrush and you want to make it more of a sharp point, you can do that. If you want to make it a smoother fall off, you can do that. If you want to make it a wide brush with a sharp fall off, you can do that. So there are a lot of ways to change that. And you can even go into options and change the brush rotation, the pressure, if you've got a tablet that you're using to draw, a depth modulator, the radius variation, so you can vary you can change or make some variations in the radius of your brush as you stroke. And one of the most useful ones is rotating a long stroke, which I'll show in a minute. And then also spacing between strokes and also fading on edges and other things that are very useful. So let me just sort of undo this until we get to something where I can demonstrate that. So let's say I want to use a brush like this chain, okay? I can paint that chain on, and notice that it doesn't, when I paint down, it kind of strings them along. In fact, let's take the strength down a little bit here. Maybe not quite that much. And you can see that I'm able to do that, but if I turn, they're not going with my stroke. So if I wanted to do that, I could say rotate along stroke. Now if I turn, the change occurs along my stroke. So that's the benefit of options. Presets are a way to save option changes and brushes together, so that if I always wanted my chain brush to rotate along my stroke, I can adjust those and save it as a preset. Strips are very useful when you want to be able to do things like, say, this zipper here. And so I'm going to change my brush to one I typically use, which is this one here. And I'll use the strip of this. In fact, I'll just use this one. This one's the zipper. And go down. It might work better if I do a different brush. So let's try this brush here. And so I've got maybe that's not a zipper. What is that? It's a cloth zipper. So there are two different zippers that I'm looking at, but essentially you can draw those in, okay? But again, if I'm stroking to the side, it may or may not go with it. It might, depending on whether it's built in or not. And if you don't want it to, you can uncheck that. But some of those are saved with that as well. And if you want to create a new strip, just click New here. And if you had a strip that you wanted, that some black and white vector shape that you want to import, you can certainly do that. In fact, let's look at the formats, and you have different image formats that you can use. Models are sort of similar. Now, models are like preset models, like primitives that we've been using. But in this case, I can click on this one, which is not a standard primitive in any application. But in this case, we do have this model that's already been done for us. It's saved as a model, and it's brought into the screen as a proxy. And I know this because if I don't actually hit apply or enter, it goes away. But it just prompted me to say, did you want to do that or did you not? And I said, oh yeah, I meant to put apply there, and it should have put it in the screen. Now in this case, it's such a smooth, thin model, it doesn't work well. It's probably one that I had created before and realized it didn't work and didn't remove it. But let's say we grab this one. Let's scale it up and hit enter. It commits it to the scene. And so now you can imagine what you can do with this. If you're creating characters all the time and you don't want to have to sculpt a hand from scratch each time, you can save it as a model and use it as a preset model you can bring into the scene, almost like a proxy. Okay, the last thing to cover here on this side are splines. And so splines can be useful at times. I don't use them very often, but some people will. And you can literally just draw these shapes based on the curve that you're drawing in. With my left mouse button, I'm clicking these, and notice you have this pop-up menu. You can press W and then left mouse click and drag and move these. You can press R and rotate them if you wanted to, or E and scale them. So if I want to scale them bigger, I can, and that helps you see like this deformation that's occurring based on this spline. So if I wanted something with more jaggies on it, then I can just go to a different tool for a second and choose this one. Let me scale my brush up a little bit, and then when I draw my curves, I start with that scale, and you can see what's happening here. So that's kind of like a neat little dragon tail and things that you can do. So that's the benefit of splines. But again, you don't have to commit that. If you do want to, press enter or whatever. And I believe the invert part works with this as well. If I press Control and Enter, it should dig into the model. Unfortunately, it didn't seem to dig in quite the way I had expected, and it could be because the sphere doesn't have enough resolution. But that's something you can play with. So this is the voxel room, basically almost entirely. The other thing I want to point out is that the Vox tree And we went over layers and selections and how to maneuver between the layers, ghosting and hiding layers. But I also want to point out this V beside them. And if you click on it, it goes from V to S, and you'll notice this toolbar changes. So here's V, and it'll come up with a prompt to go to V. And then S, and basically it means surface mode is like it's already being represented as a hollow polygonal shape, even though if you press wireframe, it won't look like that. And then if you and wireframe is W, by the way. But if you press this S key, you'll see that you have a different set of tools here. So what works well in surface mode won't necessarily work well in voxel mode, or may not even appear in voxel mode, depending upon what you're trying to do on the scene. So that's how you flip between those. The other thing I want to point out is that you see here it says sphere, and then there's this 1 times. That's the resolution. So in this case, we've got a cube that we put on the scene. I didn't do any adjustments to. Let me change its material. But the sphere has a 1 times beside it. That's because it was brought in with a certain amount of resolution before it came into the scene. But if I want to increase that, I can click on this little icon down here and say, yeah, I want it to take up more space in memory. I want it to be larger, which in this case is about 1,300,000 polys represented. And that's how large it is in memory and in terms of its relative, I should say, represented polygonal count, But you'll notice that it has this 2 times here now. So if I do it again, it should say 4 times, and then 8 times, and then 16 times, or how many times you want to do it. And so it took a second there, but now it says 4 times. And you can do the same thing by decreasing the level. If you decrease it, what happens is it'll go from 4 times to 2 times, but it'll also make a copy of that layer. So you haven't destroyed your original one, but you have a copy of that. So if your original one was, say, 6 million polys, and we remove it, let's just delete that layer by clicking the trash can. If we look at our downgraded one, we're back to 1,300,000 poly represented count there. The other thing you want to point out, or I want to point out, is that you can do a new layer this way by clicking on that or clicking the plus sign on root. If you click the plus sign beside one of the layers, you get a child layer. And if for some reason you want to remove that, click on the trash can. If you want to make this cube layer, for instance, a child of the sphere layer, what you can do is right-click, change parent to sphere, and it indents it. And we know this because if I click that plus sign, it will collapse or expand to show its child to parent, parent to child relationship. If I want to bring the cube back out to the root, I'll change the parent to root. So those are some features. The other cool thing is that you can clone these layers. So if I want to duplicate that cube, press clone on that layer, and then you'll see that I have another cube here. There are some other features here that I don't usually use very often, if at all. But there's this, if you're ever questioning what you have on a particular area, or tool or function, in many cases there are pop-ups with descriptions, in some cases visual imagery to show you the help on things. So that's very useful as well. In this case, it's saying create space with identical density and transformation. It is important if you want to use copy tool without losing quality. So there is a copy tool, and if you want to use it without losing quality, then create a new space using the copy tool. So that's essentially what this will do. There's a symmetrical copy. And then this part here where it says clear current object. So if I do that, you'll notice that all the objects in that layer, or the current object in that layer, gets cleared out. And I guess the only other thing I could show you about the voxel room is the menu. So there are a lot of things that you can do out in the regular user interface here that can also be done up here in the menu, and some things that can't be done unless you go into the menu. Like if I want to use my CUDA cores, which are basically built-in functionality of my graphics card, if it can support that, then I can check that. And some other things that are in here as well, like multi-core. In this case, I have a 6-core processor, and so I can check that on to use all of them or not. It's basically called threading, or core, using your multi-core, using more than one core to process what's going on the screen. There's a lot of other things. I guess the last thing, and I keep thinking of things that I should cover, but this is one that I think is critical, is how do I do things with symmetry. So I'm going to change my view to orthographic mode. I'm going to turn off my axes, and I'm going to show you. In fact, let's delete some of these layers here for a second. I'm going to show you the symmetry tool. So if you press S, you get a symmetry tool, and you can click on one of these axes, and you'll see a symmetry plane cut right down the axes. In fact, let me turn axes back on so you can see this and my graph off. It's slicing where I can do things on either side of the X axis, or in this case, a Y axis, Z axis, etc. So if I say X axis, whatever I paint onto one side should happen to both sides equally. Now, if I don't want to see that plane, I can click on S and basically toggle off Show Symmetry Plane, which means that I won't see the symmetry plane, but whatever I do on one side will occur on the other. So let me, and then of course I can turn it off by clicking on No Symmetry. So if I do that and then try to create something on one side, it will not occur on the other. Another thing to point out is you may have noticed there's this very faint square across your viewport here, or covering your viewport. Whatever you do with your mouse cursor inside there will work as we've been discussing. But if for some reason, let's say you want to rotate this object, okay? I can do that by clicking on this transform tool and rotating that object. But if for some reason this tool is appearing outside of that box and I try to grab that tool, it won't do it. This outside box is merely to adjust the camera, whereas what's inside that box will affect the shape itself or the camera, depending on what you're trying to do. So that gives you an idea of what's going on there. Anyway, I don't want to go too much in depth because this is an introduction to the Voxel room, but hopefully you've learned a lot here, and I look forward to the next video.